In October 2018, the Climate Change and Energy Futures Workshop was held at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland. The workshop was co-organized by Mark C.J. Stoddart of Memorial University, John McLevey of the University of Waterloo, Vanessa Schweizer at the University of Waterloo, and Ling Wong at the University of Luxembourg. The workshop included participants from Australia, Canada, Finland, Germany, Iceland, India, Luxembourg, and the United States. Participants also represented a range of disciplines, including sociology, geography, political science, and environmental studies, as well as community speakers. The presentations and discussions generated new insights into how energy systems may be reconfigured to address the problem of climate change and promote social-ecological well-being. Transdisciplinary and international contributions focus on the social challenges, possibilities, and trade-offs involved in pursuing fossil fuels, nuclear power, hydroelectric, and emerging renewable energy technologies. Welcome to the 8th episode of Crosscurrents, a podcast of Memorial University's Nexus Center for Humanities and Social Sciences Research. My name is John Sandlos, and I'm the director of the center and also the producer of the podcast. In this episode, you'll be listening to 2 talks from the workshop and also some short interviews with participants who talked about their workshop experience. The first talk is by Angela Carter from the University of Waterloo with the title of The Political Economy of Decarbonization Policy in Petrostates Towards a Comparative Framework.
But I want to show you the comparative explanatory framework, which I'm trying to use, which I think crosses many of the disciplines that we're working in here. And then, I'll end with, does this even matter? What do we do with the Canadian petrostate? Just sort of some small questions there. All right, so the turn to supply-side literature. The way we think about climate change now, we often think, and when I say we, I mean our international governance systems, we think about the level of demand side or dealing with end-of-pipe consumption side. And that's something that we see represented at the UNFCCC. And when we talk about carbon pricing, that's the kind of tool, that's the kind of approach that we're taking, a demand side. But we know that to date, focusing just on the demand side hasn't been working. We know that, and I'm sure you have this tattooed on your arm somewhere, we've got a very big difference between where we need to go in terms of keeping within a stable climate, 1.5 degrees, and where we're actually going, even with our wonderful international pledges and so forth. We've got a huge gap. So how do we get there? That IPCC report that just came out a few days ago was showing us that the kinds of steep declines that we need, the curve is getting sharper all the time. And it seems like the tools that we have to create that kind of decline, they're not quite enough. Especially when we get right back to the root and the heart of what's causing the climate crisis. Well, we've got new bodies of research that are coming out to put the pin right on the fossil fuel sector, to say that not only historically have fossil fuels been the dominant contribution or contributing factors to climate change, but that is growing all the more so. Okay, so you can see some numbers here post the 2000s. So this is a graphic. It's a little bit outdated, but it gives us a sense of sort of the flows of where emissions at the end in terms of GHGs are coming from, and we can really target them right to our 3 big fossil fuels. Okay. All right, so the reason, given that, we have seen in the last 5 or so years in particular, a development in the scholarly literature towards supply control or supply side. Excellent piece by Lazarus et al. Some really cool work coming out of this group. And this gives you a sense of the toolkit on the supply side, things that we can do if we want to get at that heart of the climate crisis. I'm interested in these 2 down here. This is what I call the KIG, the Keep It in the Ground initiative. So when you're limiting the extraction or a type of extraction, or blocking the infrastructure that would be facilitating the expansion of that extraction. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say KIG. Green and Dennis, also two really incredible individuals whose new work is just coming out now, are basically laying out this menu of things that we can do to get at the climate crisis on the supply side and on the demand side, both in terms of restrictive and supportive policies. And so the KIG, the bans that I'm concerned with, are right up there in that top left-hand quadrant, thinking about supply control, restricting. Okay? Now, so I'm all, excited about the scholarly literature that's been developing since about, well, really 2009, 2015 even. But of course, communities have known this for a really long time. In the 1990s, we saw the rise of community opposition to oil developments in Ecuador and Nigeria. These are conflicts that are continuing, and we see them in new communities every month, it seems. So the non-governmental organization community picked up on this contradiction really early. In a 1997 piece by Bill Hare, working with Greenpeace, he developed this notion of a carbon budget, saying, okay, if we are going to keep a safe climate, here's what this implies for fossil fuels, given how many reserves we know are out there and that companies are intent on extracting. This notion, so that's 1997. George Monbiot really threw this notion into the mainstream in 2007 after one of the Conference of the Parties, when he had this really cheeky article about his new technology for reducing climate change emissions. And the new technology was don't pull it out of the ground, right? Keep it in the ground. This notion was picked up by Bill McKibben. Bill McKibben, as I'm sure many of you have seen, he had this fantastically popular Rolling Stone article and then a campaign that sparked a divestment and leave it in the ground movement all over the United States and Canada. So this is where we really get that idea coming into popular culture. And so in 2014, when Naomi Klein wrote her fabulous book, This Changes Everything, she was able to draw out this concept of blockadia, which is exactly what's happening in your case, literally digging out the road. I think that's an incredible photograph that you used. And so what she's noting is this global rise of resistance to what were formerly routine, done deal, extractive projects. What's interesting, I think, for us is that often these forms of local opposition are not happening preliminarily or primarily because of climate change, but because of local concerns that can be scaled up to have people think about climate change. All right, so, and we see this bubbling up even in our major fossil fuel producing states. So we see examples in Australia. I'm sure some of you can speak more to this than I can. In Germany, the civil disobedience against coal in particular, and even in the very heartland of our oil economy, right? So these notions of keeping it in the ground that are becoming part of how we can talk and think in dominant conversations. Some of the researchers now are thinking that Benedictor is an article that I can share when we start sharing resources after the conference. But basically, he's thinking that we're at a point where this leave it in the ground movement is starting to consolidate globally. And there are a few really huge initiatives, and one of them is the Lofoten Declaration from just a year or so ago. So we have long-term community movements in this direction. We see non-governmental organizations and research institutes picking up on this idea. It's consolidating. In terms of our scholarly work, this Munchausen piece in 2009 was when we really start getting a supply-side focus. And this was early research noting that about 2/3 of our existing fossil fuel reserves have got to stay in the ground if we're going to stay within a 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming threshold. This one should have made any Canadian stand up and take notice. This is McLevey and Ekins, and they were basically laying out for us that about 74% of our reserves, we can never burn them. I mean, if that should really shake up our notion about what Canada looks like into the future. But now we have some very, and as you can see, very, very new 2018 work on fossil fuel bans from various major journals on the impact of fossil or social movements, an interest-based approach, and more of a normative-based approach. So these are important for me for my theoretical framework. All right, so what about these recent international KIG cases? Well, just since December 2017, so we're not even a year ago, we have seen some serious, significant movement in terms of keep it in the band legislation. Something big is happening, and it's happening really quickly. So we see France, first country to have legislation on phasing out oil and gas production and a just transition, worked right into that legislation. I've tried to sort of pin how many billion barrels of oil we're talking about that would be left in the ground. Some of these are a bit uncertain, and I can't get those numbers. You see Belize following. Norway, this is a ban that they've decided to continue in an Arctic area. Ireland, so this is just moving through public consultations in July, a ban on new oil and gas exploration, and then New Zealand. So something has shifted internationally, and this is something that 5 years ago we never would have predicted. Okay? All right, so what I want to do, forward-looking, this is my new task for myself, is to think about, what are the political conditions that are driving these bans? What can we learn from these bans that allow us to have more of them, right? There is an activist element to this. For me, with a focus on developed state cases that are major producers. So those are the ones that have the most responsibility as well as the most capacity to move in this direction. And I am using a 3I, so interest, institutions, and ideology, ideation, discourse, however you want to call that, as my framework. And this has been something that we've been using since the late 1990s in comparative political economy, this 3I framework. But we're seeing it applied more and more to climate policy, and in particular to KIG climate analysis, keep it in the ground policy initiatives. So it's not like I'm pulling this out of thin air either. There's a precedent for it. So generally, when we think about these 3 I's, I realize there's a lot of text. I always tell my husband, don't do this. I edit his slides and I say, this is too much, and then I go ahead and do it. But he's not here, so I can do this. So interests, institutions, and ideas. We have the clash of the big power holders and the contestation against that. Institutions, how the structures of our societies can reflect those interests, but also how we can have openings within those institutional structures for change. And ideas that are both legitimizing the status quo or contesting. So that's basically what I'm thinking about there. So when I look at the literature so far on Keep It in the Ground, I have to say I have not done an exhaustive all the way through assessment of this. These are really early hints, so I'll just pull out a few things for you. But here are some of the things that I'm seeing in terms of the barriers to keep it in the ground policy, and then some openings or opportunities. Okay, so at the institutional level, certainly there's this notion of resource-cursed petrostates. Those are two concepts that I've worked with for some time in my own work that has really entrenched fossil fuel production or extraction, particularly in these major producing states. And then I've mentioned some things about the international governance ways of thinking and doing that blind us, if you will, to the supply side. Interests, of course, a strong carbon coalition, however you want to call that in your field. We have lots of ways of describing that. And then on the ideational side, so petrocultures, this idea of oil is the lifeblood of our economy. That's a quote from a former Albertan premier. Or, and I'm so glad Carrie's here, the psychological barriers and how they get sort of scaled up as societal barriers to doing something about climate change. But there are also, and this is where the literature is exciting and forward-looking, I've spent about 13 years thinking about the environmental policy quagmire around extraction in Canada's petro provinces, and it's a really depressing body of research. This is very forward-looking, and this is what I really needed. Anyways, so the literature is showing us that there are opportunities of plasticity, windows that can open institutionally, and those can come through things like disasters and the typical things like election cycles and all of that, but also some of these norm entrepreneurs that are pushing forward a new agenda. Also, institutional shifts in the financial community. Okay, so different notions of what risk is and how that's getting translated. The rise of a green coalition. Many of you work in a green coalition, so you know what this looks like. But this is creating a new vested interest towards decarbonization. That's what that captures there. And then on the normative side, the ideational side, anti-fossil fuel norms, which are extraordinarily spreadable given how clear and precise they are. It's not about sort of, how do we figure out pricing and that's who pays for what. It's about going after the people who are pulling the stuff out of the ground that's causing climate change. It's very clear. The demand is clear. Stop digging, right? Very spreadable notions. In the financial community, the idea of a carbon bubble or stranded asset. Okay, so these are very powerful ideational. These are very powerful notions. I won't dwell on this for long, but great new research coming out that is precisely assigning responsibility that is driving some of this ideational work. Eck, Wurzel, Frumhoff, Heedy, some great people that, and Oreskes, of course, that are working on figuring out how to assign, responsibility for global warming by corporation. Okay, really, really interesting notion that's changing. That's great. That's changing how we think about this debate. All right. But we could take a step back from these bans and really question their import, because when we look really closely at them, as I'm starting to do now, we see that these are very small reserves that are being kept in the ground by non-major, so minor players in terms of fossil fuel producers. These bans can be very piecemeal, long out into the future, right? So maybe we can just say these are of no importance whatsoever. I don't think so, though, because of their symbolic power and their norm-shifting power, as well as the way in which they create a whole new policy model that could be adapted. And I think what we could say is that these are examples of early movers that, and some of us talked about tipping points and cascading effects for climate, right? We know this for climate change. We get to certain points, we get positive feedback, big trouble. Same thing can happen, though, for decarbonization, right? We can tip in the other direction. So my hunch, and maybe, I'm having a good day, is that we're at a really critical juncture here, because suddenly we have a suite of bans on climate grounds that we're seeing implemented very rapidly in these countries, and maybe these are early movers. All right, so fostering KIG at home. I'm so frustrated with this man, so this is the least I could do. This is our Prime Minister. So this is a very interesting time for Canada, though, right? Because we are caught in this quandary of being a massive fossil fuel producer and supposedly a leader in terms of climate policy. And we see this said by our Prime Minister, on the one hand, we've got to phase out the tar sands, we've got to transition off fossil fuels. On the other hand, no idiot would just leave the oil in the ground, right? And so in terms of climate denialism, which Carrie has mined for us and really laid bare and laid clear for us, we're at this new moment in Canada where, we admit climate change is a problem, Canada is a major contributor, we're going to build a pipeline. And you can say all those things, right, and still have political legitimacy. So this is a really tough case in terms of moving KIG, maybe. But we see it actually blooming all over the country. Fracking bans, successful pipeline opposition, ongoing pipeline opposition. Quebec in Anticosti Island has got a new, just of July 2017, a ban. Permits have been granted to corporations, had been withdrawn, okay? Indigenous-led in many cases, by women on the front lines, okay? Very powerful movements. And a lot more opportunities for this kind of thing to continue right here off the coast of my beautiful province, Old Harry, and off the coast of Nova Scotia just next door as well. So, yes, I think Canada is definitely a tough case for keep it in the ground, but there's lots of it popping up at the subnational level as well. So I will stop there and say another big thank you and pleasure to be here.
Next, we'll hear a short interview with Cole Atlin from the University of Waterloo.
It's really great to be at an event like this because for me, I work on environmental assessment work. That's where my focus is. Next generation environmental assessment projects as a practitioner, so as a consultant, but also as an academic. So coming and talking about climate change and thinking about these sort of on-the-ground projects that I'm working on and thinking at them through the lens of a lot of theoreticians that are in the room, a lot of people who have different perspectives than I do, it really enriches the work that I do. And I came to this 2 years ago in Waterloo, the same symposium, and I've just found it really interesting, really thought-provoking and engaging, and really supportive, academically supportive. People were there to try and support other people's ideas and help them build up into something better. And I like being part of processes like that. I like to be part of a collaborative process. And I think that what this is at its best is this collaborative conceptualization of energy futures, climate change, and working towards those things. So yeah, so far it's been great. I've been thoroughly enjoying it.
Great.
So.
Thank you.
Up next, we'll hear a short conversation with community speaker Kathleen Perwick.
Number of provocative questions, obviously, that have been posed. For me, it's a step outside of my own disciplinary and practitioner space, but in a really interesting sort of parallel set of thought processes around how to work with people and informing a lot of the ideas that presumably underlie a lot of the practices that I enact as a planner, as a governance sector worker, and I find that a really interesting exercise to go through, on a more or less regular basis, and one that does sort of draw me back and is posing a few new questions, as I reflect on both my own doctoral research, now removed, several years, but also in the work that I'm doing on a regular basis right now in the local government sphere in Newfoundland and Labrador, around a lot of the things that are implicit in the ways that we conduct ourselves, and the nature of the questions that we're posing, and the way we choose to use some of the information that's made available, and perhaps offers a few points of departure for more critical analysis of that information. So yeah, I'm very glad I've been able to have these couple of days, particularly following as it does on our convention. Annually, we get all the membership together, and so that's meant to be the big sort of group think moment where we come up with and set the direction, if you will, for the next year. And but of course, it's a very there are all kinds of factors that play into what actually gets discussed there, and so yeah, I'm sort of thinking about what some of the gaps may be that we might want to carry forward, particularly in the current process of legislative review that's going on in the province, because some of these questions really do bear some examination in legislative ends and means as well. So yeah, lots to think about.
And now a short interview with Thomas La Antilla from the University of Helsinki.
Yeah, it's been a really great workshop, especially because we had people from different fields. We just had a discussion today about scenarios and people who study the scenarios and how that gets into how science is used in policymaking. So we had a good discussion about the recent IPCC report and who's the audience of that thing, who it gets written to, and how then it gets interpreted by different people as as a kind of a story that needs to be convincing for policymakers. So that's the kind of things that you might not discuss unless you had people doing, someone from scenario studies, someone from political science, someone from sociology, these kind of things. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And now we listen into an interview with Vanessa Schweizer from the University of Waterloo.
So something that's really great about this workshop is the fact that we have these interdisciplinary social scientists looking at the various angles of futures as it relates to energy, also as it relates to climate change, and just the future of what our lifestyles are going to be, and what we can do to try to have a sustainable lifestyle and a sustainable future that is good for everyone. I really like that this workshop is bringing those different social scientific perspectives together to both critically interrogate these futures, but then also talk about how can we actually use social science and our social science knowledge to build the kinds of futures that we want.
Next up, we'll hear a few thoughts from Andreas Klinke from Memorial University's Grenfell campus.
First of all, I think the presentations were giving us quite good insights of a broad range of studies, some from very applied over typical theory-driven empirical research to theoretical studies. So this was good. The other side was, and we had a lot of discussions on that, on the other side, what is connected to that, the quality of these presentations is the format of the workshop. So I really appreciate and being thankful that we do not have only the presentations and short time for questions and answers. So we have a lot of time for really in-depth discussions and exchange of ideas and thinking beyond the actual presentations. So on that is, with regard to that, what I said with the quality and the substance of the presentation, I think that creates something, even at a first instant it looks like, oh, we cover now a broad range of topics. Nevertheless, we already in the discussions on the one side, we identified differences and divergences. Mm-hmm. On the other side, we also identified a lot of commonalities and overlapping kind of interest that we all have with regard to that kind of research we do. Yes. So I think that is a very interesting format, and I like to see more of that. Mm-hmm. And I hope that we will have now a fruitful discussion that somehow channels into a product that we can publish, because I think that is always also an important point, that we have a goal with regard to a publication or something like that, and then we set another goal, how we continue the next workshop so that it becomes a kind of series and a kind of routine among a small community of researchers that have the same interest and the same kind of research ongoing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And now we'll hear the short interview with Carrie Norgard from the University of Oregon.
Thank you. This is Carrie Norgard, and I've been thinking in meeting spaces like this where there's interdisciplinary groups of people working on climate change for at least the last decade, if not quite a bit longer. And this is probably the most exciting such space I've been in. And the reason for that is, in fact, it's really renewed my enthusiasm for doing this kind of work. I'd been quite frustrated with there's been on the one hand, often either the conversations will be very theoretical but not enough applied, and there's so much urgency to the issue. Or on the other hand, the ones that are applied are not sufficiently theoretically informed to be very useful. And so the particular combination of minds and expertise in this room was really very exciting.
Okay.
The last of the short interviews is with Carl Benediktsson from the University of Iceland.
I came from Iceland to attend this workshop. I thought it was really very interesting, partly because there are so many people from different parts of the world, but also because there are people with quite different backgrounds. And I think in environmental studies of any kind, it's always a bonus if you can get together people from different parts of academia, actually, to discuss these things, because they are, after all, very, very transdisciplinary, and we have to work in that way if we want to solve any environmental problems that we face.
Thank you.
And last, you'll hear a talk by Mark Stoddart from Memorial University titled Envisioning Social Futures in the Oil Industry, Avoidance, Persistence, and Transformation as Responses to Climate Change and the Low-Carbon Transition.
All on the bigger project. So in addition to Natalie being a co-author on this, So is Patrick McCurdy from Ottawa U, and Corey Collins, one of our graduate students here at Memorial. So basically, one of the things this paper does looks specifically at the oil sector. So I'm not actually going to talk about tourism at all for this. That's out of the project for this. And it looks at whether or how the Paris COP meetings and agreement worked or didn't as a kind of a critical event to kind of drive the need to envision new social futures in the energy sector, in kind of oil kind of host societies and so on. Here using the kind of critical event stuff that Howard has written about in the past and with regard to social movements in particular. Partly what I'm most interested in here as well is a question of what role, if any, environmental organizations, the NGOs, and civil society groups play in kind of provoking these kinds of new social futures. These kind of this reflection on the need to reshape social futures related to oil and energy kinds of development, right? So in environmental sociology, there's kind of a strand of theory called ecological modernization theory, kind of particularly popular kind of in European environmental sociology, that kind of says that pro-environmental change happens largely through collaboration amongst government actors, corporate actors, and civil society, NGO kind of actors. So that's kind of part of the reason why the attention to ENGOs here, right? So in terms of the actual then data that we're looking at here is we're looking at different fields of interaction within the oil sector in Norway, Scotland, and Newfoundland and Labrador. And we're looking at what kinds of social futures the oil sectors in Newfoundland and Labrador, Scotland, Norway are kind of envisioning in what we might call the empowered spaces of the sector. So using their industry events as sources of data, right, about how they're talking to each other about what the world is going to be looking like, right? And why look at the oil sector? Well, I kind of covered it well in this session. They are a key sector implicated in climate change. They're often targeted by social movements, as we've heard in the last 3 papers. And as I say, here we're looking at, though, not so much the resistance side, but actually the empowered spaces where oil sector elites hang out with and talk to each other, right? So their conferences, right? Which are very interesting spaces. What Haley and Dryzek refer to as kind of empowered spaces of kind of deliberation, right? And kind of insiders speaking to each other kind of stuff. And something that Natalie always wants me to remember is that this is about a sectoral or kind of regional level analysis, not about individual firms. Although there are some really interesting differences between the sectors that I think are highly influenced by what firms are operating within them. And I've kind of played a little bit with network analysis looking at that, and I think there is some interesting stuff there, but yeah, it's careful to remember that we're comparing regions or the kinds of empowered spaces, not individual firms here. Right. So, starting with the main takeaway points, we often get this idea of kind of the oil sector is a little bit kind of monolithic, as kind of like this kind of singular kind of entity with a singular set of interests. I would argue that based on our data, we see a multiplicity of different types of social futures envisioned in different spaces of the sector. One, which we would talk about, is maybe a logic of avoidance, where climate change and social futures get limited attention, and low carbon transitions and stuff like that. Second, a logic of persistence, basically saying that the social, political, technological landscape is shifting. How can the oil sector adapt to remain relevant and competitive and all that kind of stuff? And the third, what we might call the logic of transformation, where basically sectoral actors are saying a low-carbon transition is happening. How do we radically re-envision ourselves and transform ourselves to keep pace, right? And that's kind of the 3 logics that I think, almost a typology we see out of these different kinds of empowered spaces at play. I'm not going to dig too deep into the kind of theoretical stuff, so I tell my grad students, who are a few of whom are sitting around the room, at a talk, I like to focus on what you did, not what you read. I think it's usually a kind of good idea, but I will flag 3 of my favorite things I've read in terms of thinking about social futures and a social futures dimension of research. And one is What is the Future? John Arie's final book before he passed away The other is Apaturi's The Future is Cultural Fact. And the third is Donna Haraway's most recent book, Staying with the Trouble. Just a couple of quick points on that, why I think they're useful. I think Haraway particularly has a very critical read of some of this Anthropocene discourse and really cautions against either techno-utopian kind of futuring or eco-apocalyptic dystopian kind of futuring. And I think that's kind of useful on one hand. Whereas Uri and Apaturi both tell us to pay way more attention to who is doing futuring, who is it being done to, who is it being done for. So I'm getting at some of the questions that Kari raised very pointedly in her talk, right? Whose energy futures, right? Who gets to do the futuring? And both Apaturi and Uri point out that the work of imagining social futures and enacting them has largely been the work of the kind of engineering class, economists, psychologists to a certain degree, government elites, right? And that we need to kind of work harder to kind of democratize who is part of the work of futuring, to kind of use kind of Uri's terminology there, right? So that's all I want to say on that, but those are, I think, all three really great books, really cool to read and thinking about the stuff for me personally. The methodological approach was event ethnography, so attending oil sector events. A couple of years ago while I was on sabbatical, in those glorious days, which included time at in Stavanger, Norway, at the ONS, the Offshore North Seas Conference, the largest oil sector conference in Norway that happens every year. Also 2 years of attending NOIA, the Newfoundland and Labrador Offshore Oil and Gas Industries Association. So that nice and close to home, so was able to go twice to that one. And then was in Aberdeen in 2017 when Oil and Gas UK did a day-long launch of their Outlook report for that year and what the year ahead looked like. So it's all kind of data from 2016-17 across the three different regions. Right? And it's also a cool approach. I know so imagine these are kind of oil sector empowered spaces, where kind of elites in the sector talk to each other, they kind of share internal discussions. But I found this really useful because as a sociologist, when I try to recruit interviewees for this project, the energy sector folks don't really respond very often. They don't typically kind of return calls or emails. So it was a matter of going to where they hang out and talk with each other as a way of getting the kind of rich data on the sector that was much harder to get through interviewing, right? It ended up being a really cool methodology, I thought, for the project. So, to jump straight into the results, really what we tended to see was, starting with the Newfoundland and Labrador Oil Industries Association, the photos from their website. So say their mission is to add value to for their members. This is fairly what the scene kind of looks like, a lot of older white gentlemen in suits. That's fairly typical of those meetings. And we did see that there was, limited talk about the Paris COP agreement, or the meetings, limited acknowledgement of climate change to a large degree. So no real sense that this was becoming a critical event that they needed to grapple with in 16 or 17. In fact, where there was some limited focus on climate change was in some of the talks that were about how climate change might create new economic opportunity because we will have more ice-free days, in theory, off the island, which therefore means you're losing less operating days, having to kind of shut down rigs or risk towing them out of the way of icebergs, stuff like that. So, I don't know if many of you maybe read Elizabeth Malone's book on kind of families of climate change discourse, the different kinds of, I think she identifies a typology of about 9 kind of varieties of climate discourse. And this is this kind of idea of opportunities from climate change that comes up. But it is pretty marginal. It's not like a mainstream thing necessarily. But that was the context where climate change was coming up to a certain degree. And finally, and maybe not surprisingly if you know the Newfoundland and Labrador scene, not much visibility of civil society voices or NGO voices. Right? Pretty marginal, pretty peripheral. Yeah. We shift our focus kind of across the Atlantic over to Scotland over there somewhere. We see a bit of a different thing. It's going on. First off, like Newfoundland and Labrador, we didn't see a lot of talk about the Paris COP agreement, at least at this event. But because it was early 2017, a lot of talk about Brexit. It was the far, far bigger critical event that the industry was grappling with and what it meant and the uncertainty of it and all that stuff, right? But there was a fair bit of talk about Scottish performance and policy on climate change and UK performance and policy. Scotland's been quite a leader. For those of you that follow the international rankings, most of what the UK is doing right, a lot of it's being driven by Scotland. The SNP is pretty aggressively trying to move in more pro-environmental ways, directions. So actually more focus on the kind of the national scale, rather than on the kind of the Paris COP agreement as a critical event. So it's quite interesting. So climate change is there, but just not necessarily framed through the Paris Agreement there. A lot more talk, though, about then how to kind of achieve a state of coexistence in the future between fossil fuels and renewables. Right? This idea that Scotland would be scaling up wind, offshore wind for the most part, would be transitioning to renewables, but at the same time, how do you get, the last bits of productivity out of what are essentially post-peak fields in the Scottish North Sea? How do you kind of make sure you get, you're not going to be a foolish country who leaves it in the ground if you still have it, while at the same time you're pushing out, massive rollout of wind power, right? So it was about how to keep oil competitive, even acknowledging that there are these transitions happening, right? And like the Newfoundland case, we really saw the invisibility of ENGO or civil society actors again, a recurring motif that I'll make theoretical sense of at the end, I think, or try to anyway. Finally, the Norwegian case offers a bit of a different perspective, a really different field in many ways. As you can see, even the oil sector exec who's giving this talk, I can't tell what company they're from, it's all about change. Right? Changes is there in huge letters, right? The theme of the conference that year was like transition kind of stuff, right? Innovation, transition, those kind of terms. Repeatedly through this conference, people kept referring to the Kodak moment, i.e., if you remember Kodak film, Kodak moment was used in their advertising slogans as like you capture the Kodak moment. But they referred to it as this kind of like, it ended up being this perverse thing. Kodak failed to adapt and innovate and went bankrupt, right? So you had, over the course of the 4 or 5 days of the conference, that term came up probably about 6 or 10 times, where executives from the oil sector said, we are now facing our Kodak moment, right? Or something similar along those lines, right? Very different mindset than we saw in the other two social fields. So here, by contrast, we actually saw the frequent invocation of the Paris COP agreement as something that was changing the social political landscape that the oil sector would have to grapple with. This increasing kind of focus on the need to respond to climate change in the sector, often through technological innovation, so through a lot of technical utopianism, carbon capture and storage, increased efficiency, stuff like that. Kind of stuff that Haraway is pretty critical of, that, yes, the oil sector is going to solve climate change, but we'll just do it by figuring out CCS technology. But it was the most, of the three cases, the most focused on the transition to renewables, but also this idea about coexistence during the transition of fossil fuels and renewables, right? And Angela alluded to, I think this came up, or Carrie, you asked about Stoddart, right? And so they've just recently rebranded as Equinor. They're divesting of a lot of their oil operations, and I think we see that as being part of this, right? Part of this kind of broader field, this transition in Norway. Similar things in Denmark, which wasn't part of this paper, but their major state-owned oil company has also basically shed its oil operations in favor of offshore wind. So we're seeing a similar kind of focus there, right? And as I said, there was this recurrence of cautionary tales, right? That the sector is living through this like moments of significant disruption that were kind of provoking this kind of reflexivity in a sense and need to radically transform. And again, maybe a little more surprisingly, the invisibility of civil society voices, ENGO voices. So we don't really see them in any of these fields, right? Contra kind of ecological modernization theory saying, oh, these are the kind of voices that would help provoke, pro-environmental change. So with my last few minutes, what do we make of all of that, kind of theoretically or interpretively? And I think first off is that, one of the big points, the oil sector is not homogenous, right? It's not a single black box kind of entity. There are multiple social futures going around, multiple logics of what the social futures will look like regarding oil, climate change, and low-carbon transitions. Avoidance, we see probably predominantly in Newfoundland and Labrador, to a lesser extent maybe in Scotland, kind of using that typology, where we see really limited attention to social futures related to climate change and renewable transitions. Here I'll just invoke Susan Dodd's great book about the Ocean Ranger disaster. It happened in Newfoundland and Labrador in the early 1980s, 1982, 81, 82. 84. Where she really argues that that Newfoundland has always had this culture that oil is the source of social well-being. So you don't reflect critically on the industry, on the relationship with the industry to a large degree. And I think we still very much see that's kind of the case, right? The persistence kind of logic is really how to keep oil competitive in this changing landscape. And we see that mostly in Scotland, maybe to a lesser extent, maybe Newfoundland and Labrador, right? And then the third being this kind of transformation logic, that the low-carbon transition is happening, the sector needs to envision it and re-envision and transform itself. Most pronounced in Norway, and I say like that kind of current process of Statoil going through its transformation to Equinor, I think, speaks to how that's continuing since the field work, in a sense. Right. But we don't really see the Paris COP agreement serving as a critical event in two of the three cases. It's really only the Norwegian case where it appears to be part of what people are grappling with, right? Kind of marginal in the others, at least in this data, yeah? Which is interesting. So, on the other hand, I also think Norway is kind of interestingly paradoxical. And here, alluding to Kari's work as well, that on one hand, the Norwegian oil sector is probably the most ecologically reflexive site, but it's still within what Brichtdale and Berit Christofferson talk about as like the oil ontology in Norway. That oil is ultimately the bedrock of the social welfare system. And Kari's written about this wonderfully as well, right? So even if we're being pro-environmental, it's still the kind of the basis of a strong social welfare system. And it is interesting that, Angela brought up the Lofoten Declaration, which has become an interesting kind of point of coherence where critical voices have kind of raised some of those more foundational issues, right? And I think, the one thing we should be asking in terms of social futures in this case is, can the Norwegian energy sector, which is arguably doing better than other oil sectors, can it be provoked to more radically re-envision itself, to more radically transform itself? And if so, who's going to do that? And I would argue, that that's really where the role for ENGOs, for civil society actors, where that comes in, where things like the Lofoten Declaration become so important. The opposition to Arctic oil exploration in Norway, the opposition to opening up the Lovse region, the Lofoten, Vesterålen, and I always can never pronounce the third one, that region to oil. So, but what we see here is that NGOs and civil society are really at the margins. They're pretty invisible within those empowered spaces where the oil sector is talking to itself, to each other, right? And again, we might tie this back to ecological modernization theory from environmental sociology. And we do kind of see a bit of this ecological modernization discourse, I would say, in the Norwegian field, but it is largely ecological modernization without social movements, without civil society, this version of it. It's being done, it's kind of ecological modernization by government and by corporate actors to a large extent. So we tie it back to the idea of futures, who gets to think futures, who gets to enact and imagine futures. It takes us right back to Apadurai and Uri, who noted that the work of doing futures is largely captured by the economists, the engineers, and so on. We don't see anything much different here when we apply that theoretical argument to these cases. That the futuring around oil, climate change, and so on, low carbon transitions, are kind of being done for us or to us by kind of governments and corporations, even in a kind of more benevolent case like Norway, for example. That still holds true, right? So I think following them, Apadurai and Uri, it's like there was some work to do there to open up the work of futuring around this stuff, right? Certainly. Yeah. And with that, I am all done. Yeah, so thank you.
To find out about future episodes of Crosscurrents, you can follow us on Twitter @Nexus Center, search up the Nexus Center Facebook page, or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or YouTube. The music used in the podcast was licensed under a Creative Commons license and you can find out more about the music through links on our show notes. The Nexus Center is generously supported by the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Vice President's Research Office at Memorial University. The Climate Change and Energy Futures Workshop was generously supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and by Memorial University. Join us for episode 9 of Crosscurrents when we continue with our series of podcasts about our recent workshops. We'll see you then.